They said 200 Apache warriors came to kill a white cowboy by dawn. But old men in these territories knew better. When warriors rode in silence, they did not always bring war. The first rider appeared when the sun was still hiding below the mesas, a dark shape moving through red dust where the prairie met the foothills. Silas Boone stood barefoot on his cabin porch, coffee cooling in his hand, watching one horse become 10 become 50, until the valley itself seemed to move. 200 riders formed a great half-circle around his little cedar cabin, stretching farther than a rifle shot in both directions. Their horses still as carved stone, breath steaming in the cold desert morning. Not a weapon lifted, not a word spoken, only wind passing through sagebrush and the faint creak of saddle leather. Silas had lived alone on that patch of land for 12 years, long enough to know when death was coming. But death did not arrive in silence like this. Came loud, hurried, uncertain. This felt older than danger. This felt like judgment. His hand drifted toward the weathered doorframe where an old medicine charm hung nailed above the threshold. Hidden in plain sight all these years. A strip of faded red cloth, a silver bead, a hawk feather worn by sun and dust. Most men would have called it trinket. Silas knew otherwise. Then she rode forward. One horse stepped from the sea of warriors, pale gray against the rising light. The woman atop it sat straight-backed, wrapped in dark buckskin, black hair moving in the wind like river water. Chief's daughter, Anna Red Hawk. Even at 50 yards Silas knew those eyes. He had seen them once before, though not in a woman's face. A memory stirred like smoke from buried coals. A child by a riverbank. Cold water. Blood on a torn shirt sleeve. And a promise never spoken aloud. The riders behind her did not move when she stopped. 200 warriors waited while one woman looked only at one man. Not the cabin. Not the rifle leaning beside the porch. Only him. The town of Dry Creek had begun waking by then, and men with half-buttoned shirts and old shotguns gathered at the ridge, staring down in terror. Someone whispered, war had come. Someone else muttered the cowboy had done some unforgivable thing. Silas heard none of it. He only watched Ayanna dismount and walk toward the porch, boots soft in the dust, every warrior holding breath with her. She stopped 10 feet away and looked at the medicine charm above his door. Her expression changed. Not anger, not mercy, recognition. You kept it, she said. Her English was low and steady as Winter Creek water. Silas swallowed hard. Didn't know who it belonged to. A faint smile touched her mouth, sad as sunset. My father does. Behind her, the riders parted, and through them came an old chief on a black stallion, face lined like canyon walls, silver in his braids, carrying no rifle, only a staff wound with eagle feathers. He raised it once toward the cabin. The gesture made every horseman bow his head. Silas felt the earth tilt under him. This was no siege. This was something stranger, something far older than revenge. Then the chief spoke words that turned the morning colder than desert frost. White man, he called, voice carrying over 200 silent riders. You owe blood or marriage. And beneath the floorboards of Silas Boone's cabin, something long buried seemed to awaken. Silence held the valley long after the old chief spoke, as if even the wind had stopped to hear what kind of debt could be paid in blood or marriage. Silas Boone did not answer at once. He stood on that porch with sun climbing over the ridgeline, the old medicine charm swaying above his door, and for the first time in years he looked less like a man defending a homestead and more like a man staring at something he had outrun only to find waiting on his doorstep. Ayanna lowered her eyes toward the rough pine boards beneath his boots. Under the floor, she said quietly, what you buried. My father says the earth remembers. The words settled in him like a stone dropped in still water. Silas had not touched what lay under those boards in 15 winters. Not since the flood season when a frightened Apache child had nearly been taken by the river and he, younger and foolish enough to believe small mercies vanished with time, wrapped her in his own coat and carried her through waist-deep current. He had found the medicine charm in the mud after her people came and vanished before dawn. He had buried something else with it, something no one knew. From the ridge, the men of Dry Creek shifted nervously, watching what they thought was a standoff. Old Marshal Kobe stepped forward, calling down that Silas should not trust any bargain made with 200 riders at his gate. But the chief raised one hand and even distant voices seemed to fall away. "Dig," he said. It was not command alone. It sounded almost ceremonial. Silas stepped inside the cabin where morning light cut through dust motes like pale smoke. The room smelled of cedar, coffee grounds, and old winters. He knelt beside the hearth and pried up a loose plank with the blade of a skinning knife. Beneath, wrapped in deer hide darkened by age, lay a silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon, etched with symbols older than the railroad. And beneath that, a folded paper browned at the edges. His breath caught. He had not looked at the letter since the day he hid it. Outside, Ayanna waited, her warriors still mounted in impossible silence. Silas carried both objects into the sun. The old chief stared at the pendant but said nothing. It was Ayanna who touched the folded paper. "Read it," she whispered. Silas opened the brittle sheet and recognized the hand immediately. A missionary woman who had passed through these territories years ago. The only one who could write Apache words in English script. The message was short. "If this charm returns to the one who saved my daughter, the debt shall be honored not with vengeance, but with kinship." Silas looked up slowly. This was a promise? The chief nodded once. A sacred one. Murmurs rippled through Dry Creek. Men who came expecting war now watched a mystery older than any land dispute unfold in the dust. Yet Silas saw something else in Ayanna's face, something unsettled, as if the promise was only half the truth. She stepped closer and pressed her hand over the silver pendant. "My father has told you the old debt," she said. "Tonight, I tell you why I came myself." Then her voice lowered almost to a secret. "There is another man riding for this valley before sundown. A man who wants this promise broken." And far off beyond the western ridge, where heat shimmered above the trail, a thin line of dust had begun to rise. The dust line beyond the western ridge grew thicker by the minute, a pale scar across the horizon, and every man in Dry Creek seemed to feel the same unease settle into his bones. Silas Boone watched it from his porch while the silver pendant lay warm in his palm, heavier now with meaning than metal. 200 Apache riders still ringed the cabin in perfect silence. Yet it was not their presence that troubled him. It was the way Ayanna had spoken of another man coming, as though something older than tribal debt was moving toward them on horseback. Old Chief Red Hawk turned his stallion toward the canyon trail and motioned for Silas to follow. "Ride with us to Red Canyon," he said. "There the promise can be judged before all elders." The words carried dignity, but Silas heard the urgency beneath them. Before he could answer, hoofbeats rose from the ridge where Dry Creek men stood armed more with fear than courage. Marshal Kobe rode down first, gray mustache stiff in the wind. "Silas," he called, "do not go wandering into Apache country over some old ghost tale." Silas looked at the old lawman, then at Ayanna, whose eyes held neither plea nor command, only certainty. "Sometimes ghosts ride back to settle what men forgot," Silas said. Even Kobe had no answer to that. By noon Silas rode between Apache warriors through a narrow wash lined with juniper and red stone, his bay gelding uneasy among painted horses and silent riders. No one spoke for miles except wind scraping canyon walls. It felt less like being taken prisoner than entering a church built by earth and time. Ayanna rode beside him at last. "The man I warned you of," she said softly. "His name is Gideon Voss." Silas felt his jaw tighten. He knew the name. Land broker, silver speculator. A man who smiled when speaking of peace and measured valleys in profit. "He has wanted our canyon springs for years," Ayanna continued. "He learned of the old promise. If it stands, alliance stands. If alliance stands, he loses the land." Silas stared ahead where cliffs opened into a basin bright with cottonwoods and spring water. "So this is not about me alone." A faint sadness touched her face. "It was never only about you." In the basin, dozens of Apache families waited near cook fires and shade shelters, old women weaving, children pausing mid-play to watch the white cowboy arrive among their people. No hostility met him, only watchfulness. At the center stood a council circle marked by stones. Chief Red Hawk dismounted and planted his feathered staff in the earth. Elders gathered. The silver pendant passed from wrinkled hands to wrinkled hands as though reading history through touch. Then an old woman with clouded eyes looked at Silas and smiled. The river man has returned. Before he could ask what she meant, thunder rolled though the sky was clear. It was not thunder. It was riders. From the southern trail came Gideon Voss with a dozen men in dust coats, stopping at the edge of the basin where Apache children stared wide-eyed. He removed his hat with practiced politeness. "Chief Red Hawk," he called, voice smooth as polished brass. "I have come to prevent a mistake." Silas felt the air tighten. Ayana's hand drifted near the pendant at her throat. Gideon's gaze moved to Silas and lingered with something colder than dislike. "That cowboy carries something I have spent 15 years searching for," he said. Then he smiled. "And before this sun sets, he may learn that promises made by rivers hide deeper secrets than love." Gideon Voss removed his gloves one finger at a time as though entering a gentleman's parlor instead of an Apache council circle, and somehow that calm unsettled Silas Boone more than any shouted threat could have. Dust drifted through the basin while elders sat unmoving around the stone ring, their silence pressing harder than accusation. Chief Red Hawk studied Gideon for a long while before speaking. "You come uninvited into sacred judgment." Gideon bowed his head just enough to mimic respect. "I come to prevent an old deception from becoming a treaty." His words moved through the gathered people like a cold breeze. Silas felt Ayana stiffen beside him. Gideon reached into his coat and produced a weathered leather ledger bound with brass corners. 15 years ago, he said, a missionary caravan vanished crossing Willow Ford. Among what was lost was a Spanish silver map hidden inside a crescent pendant. He pointed not at the pendant in the elder's hands, but at Silas. The cowboy did not simply rescue a child at that river. He stumbled upon something men have hunted ever since. Murmurs rose among the traders who rode with Gideon, but the Apache elders remained unreadable. Silas remembered the flood, the child, the coat wrapped around shivering shoulders, but no map. Or had there been something in that pendant he never knew? Before he could answer, the old woman called River Grandmother lifted the pendant toward the sun. Light flashed through tiny etched grooves Silas had never noticed. They formed not decoration, but lines. Routes, watermarks, hidden springs. Gideon smiled faintly. "That canyon belongs to whoever holds the map." Chief Red Hawk struck his staff against stone once. "No land belongs to paper." Yet even he seemed troubled. Ayana stepped into the council circle before anyone summoned her, dark braid moving across buckskin shoulders. "This is not why my people kept the promise," she said. "The debt was for life saved." Gideon turned toward her with a softness too polished to be trusted. "And yet your father's promise binds you to a man who may carry fortune beyond imagining." Silas heard the trap in it. Make love look like greed, honor look like bargain. An old frontier trick. Then Chief Red Hawk raised a hand for silence. "There is one way truth is judged." Every elder nodded. Trial of the spring. Silas did not know the words, but Ayana's expression changed. This was older than law. The chief pointed toward a narrow trail climbing red cliffs beyond camp. "At moonrise the river man walks to the hidden spring, alone except for my daughter as witness. If his heart seeks gold, the spring reveals it. If his heart keeps faith, the promise stands." Gideon gave a thin smile. "And if he fails? Then the debt becomes blood." The phrase settled over the basin like dusk shadow. Yet no menace lay in it. Now only consequence. Silas looked toward Ayana. "You trust this trial?" She met his eyes steadily. "I trust what the spring remembers." Preparations began as afternoon light slanted amber through cottonwoods. Women laid sage on coals. Elders whispered in Apache too old for Silas to follow. Even Gideon withdrew to his camp with a look that suggested calculation still at work. As the sun dipped, Ayana handed Silas a waterskin and touched the old pendant once before placing it back in his palm. Her fingers lingered only a breath. "When we reach the spring," she said softly, "I must tell you what happened after the river carried me away that day." Silas felt something move deeper than fear. Why wait until now? Her eyes turned toward the cliffs darkening purple against the sky. "Because what I tell you may change who you believe you are." And above the canyon rim, the first evening hawk circled where the hidden spring waited. Moonrise found Silas Boone and Ayanna Red Hawk climbing a narrow trail where red stone walls held the day's warmth and the scent of sage drifted in cool night air. Below them, the council fires looked like scattered embers on the basin floor, and far beyond, Gideon Voss's camp lanterns flickered like watchful eyes. Neither spoke for nearly a mile. Only boots on stone, horse reins brushing leather, and the distant call of a night bird moved through the silence. It was Ayanna who stopped first where the trail bent beside a spring spilling from rock in a silver thread no wider than a hand. The hidden spring. Water gathered in a still pool black as polished obsidian, reflecting moonlight so bright it seemed lit from beneath the earth. "My people say the spring keeps memory," she said. "It returns truth to those who have buried it." Silas knelt and cupped water in his hands. It was colder than mountain snowmelt. For a long moment neither touched the old pendant resting between them on a flat stone. Then Ayanna began. "When you carried me from the river, I was not lost by accident." Silas looked up. Her face in moonlight seemed younger and older at once. "My father was meeting men from the mission caravan that day. They carried maps to hidden springs and treaties no railroad men were meant to see. Gideon Voss rode with them." The name settled heavy. There was an argument. Greed wearing polite clothes. "I ran when the flood came." Silas stared into the water as old fragments shifted. A frightened child clutching something silver. A rider on a distant ridge. He had forgotten because survival on the frontier often demanded forgetting. "Why did you never come back?" he asked. Ayanna smiled sadly. "I did." She touched the pendant. "3 winters after the flood, I came to your cabin while you were gone with cattle. I left the medicine charm above your door. I saw the way you lived alone." She hesitated. "And I stayed hidden in the trees until dawn." Something in Silas softened that had been hard for years. Wind moved through juniper branches overhead with a whisper like old voices. Then Ayanna stepped nearer the pool and motioned him beside her. "The trial is simple. Place the pendant in the spring. If a man seeks wealth, silver sinks. And if he seeks honor?" She met his eyes. "It returns." Silas almost laughed at the impossible old magic of it. Yet nothing in this canyon had felt ordinary since sunrise. He lowered the pendant into the pool. It slipped from his fingers, vanished beneath dark water, and for a heartbeat the spring went still as death. Then moonlight trembled across the surface. The pendant rose slowly and drifted back against his hand. Ayanna drew in breath as though hearing a prayer answered. But before either spoke, hoofbeats echoed from below. Too fast for ceremony. Too urgent. They looked down the trail where a young Apache rider climbed hard, horse lathered from speed. He reached them breathless. "Chief sends warning," he said. "Gideon has told the council the Cowboy's land deed sits atop the same hidden spring route. He claims only marriage will give him claim to both peoples." Silas felt anger rise, not hot but clear. Another man turning honor into property. Yet the young rider had not finished. He looked uneasily toward Ayanna. "And Gideon has revealed something else before the elders." A pause. Even the spring seemed to listen. "He says the riverman may not be the stranger he believes." Ayanna turned pale beneath moonlight. Silas frowned. "What does that mean?" The rider lowered his voice. "He says your mother once lived among the Apache." And in the spring water at Silas's knees, the silver pendant began to glow with reflected light as if some older secret had only just awakened. Silas Boone did not answer the rider at once because some truths arrived too quietly to be fought. The words about his mother lingered in the cold air above the spring while moonlight ran silver over water and stone. He remembered fragments he had long dismissed as childhood fog. His mother humming in a language no one in Dry Creek spoke. A beadwork pouch she kept hidden in a cedar trunk. The way she once said, When he was no more than 10, that blood was less important than the hands that raised a man. At the time, he thought it frontier wisdom. Now every memory seemed to tilt toward another shape. Ayanna touched his sleeve lightly, not as comfort but as grounding. "We go back," she said. Before Gideon twists silence into truth. They descended fast through moon-shadowed rock, the young rider leading, hooves striking sparks where stone narrowed. Yet even in urgency there was a strange calm in Silas, as though some hard knot tied years ago had begun loosening. In the basin council fires burned lower, but voices carried sharper now. Gideon Voss stood at the stone circle speaking to elders with grave courtesy, his kind of danger always dressed in reason. When Silas entered, conversations stopped. Chief Red Hawk remained seated, unreadable, but River Grandmother motioned him forward. Gideon spread open his brass-bound ledger beside an old folded letter newly drawn from his coat. "I have shown the council missionary records," he said. "A white woman named Eleanor Boone wintered among the Chiricahua before marrying a ranch hand." Silas felt his chest tighten at his mother's name. Gideon continued with practiced softness. "She carried Apache lineage through adoption oath if not blood. Meaning this cowboy stands closer to this people than he was ever told." Murmurs moved through gathered families, not hostile, almost reverent. Yet Gideon was not done. Which means, the marriage promise may bind more than romance. It may unite claim over Canyon Springs and Silas Boone's ranch under ancient custom. There it was again. Land disguised as destiny. Before Silas could speak, Ayanna stepped before the council. "You turn kinship into purchase." Her voice rang clear as struck silver. "This promise was never for land." Gideon smiled faintly, then refused the marriage and let the old debt become blood. But something changed in the circle then. Chief Red Hawk rose slowly, taller than his years. "Enough." One word, and even Gideon fell quiet. The chief lifted the pendant toward firelight. "The spring has judged honor. Yet another trial remains." He turned to Silas. "If your mother carried Apache oath, there is one man living who can testify." A hush deeper than silence followed. "My brother Taze," the chief said, "who left this tribe 20 years ago and became a scout for the army. He rides home by dawn." Gideon's composure flickered, almost too small to see. Silas noticed. Anna noticed too. And for the first time Gideon looked less certain of his own game. Later, as camp settled uneasy beneath stars, Silas stood alone near the cottonwoods when Ayanna approached carrying his mother's beadwork pouch River Grandmother had found among the missionary records. He took it with trembling hands. Inside lay a small turquoise stone and a scrap of paper in Eleanor Boone's hand. One line only. "When the hawk returns to Red Canyon, trust the daughter of the chief." Silas looked up stunned. Ayanna's eyes held their own astonishment. "Your mother knew my people would call you back." But before either could speak more, a horn sounded from the outer ridge. Riders approaching before dawn. Not one scout, many. And Gideon Voss, watching from his fire across camp, slowly smiled as if the real contest had only just begun. The horn on the ridge sounded again before dawn, longer this time, and the entire basin stirred awake beneath a pale sky. Men rose from blankets, women fed coals back into flame, children were drawn close to elders, and every eye turned toward the eastern trail where riders descended through blue morning shadow. Silas Boone stood beside Chief Red Hawk as 12 mounted figures approached, each carrying no banner, no rifle raised, only the dust of long travel. At their front rode an old man broad-shouldered despite age, silver braids tied with faded army ribbon. Taze, the lost brother. He dismounted without ceremony and walked straight to Silas, studying his face in a silence so deep even Gideon Voss held his breath. Then the old scout smiled faintly. "Eleanor Boone had your mother's eyes," he said. The words moved through camp like sunrise breaking frost. Silas felt something inside him steady. A life once framed by orphaned fragments was beginning to gather shape. Yet Gideon stepped forward before comfort could settle. "Touching history," he said smoothly, "but blood tales do not settle land rights." His hand rested on the brass ledger. The council must still decide whether promise becomes marriage or forfeiture. There it was again. His trap tightened with every turn. But Taze turned toward him with a look sharpened by frontier years. "You speak of law," he said, "yet hide what you did at Willow Ford." Gideon's smile thinned. Murmurs stirred. Chief Red Hawk lifted his staff. "Speak." Taze looked not at Gideon but at the gathered warriors. The mission caravan was not lost in flood alone. Traders among them sought to sell spring routes to railroad men. One man betrayed the treaty. His gaze settled on Gideon. No accusation shouted. No spectacle. Just truth placed in open air. Gideon laughed softly, too quickly. Old stories told by an old scout. But River Grandmother rose, leaning on a willow cane. "Then let the daughter choose." Every face turned to Ayanna. Under ancient custom, the chief's daughter could affirm or reject the marriage promise before all warriors. Yet tradition demanded she stand alone. She walked through 200 mounted riders as dawn lit the canyon walls gold, and the sight held a silence no gunfight could equal. She passed her father, past Taze, past Gideon, then stopped beside Silas Boone. Not near him, beside him. Her voice carried steady as river current. "I choose the man who saved life without asking tribe or color. I choose the man the spring returned." A breath seemed to leave the whole basin. Gideon stepped forward at last, edge showing through polished manners. "Then you condemn your people to lose these waters." But Ayanna turned and answered with quiet force. "No, I deny you the lie that love can be purchased with land." Even some of Gideon's own riders lowered their eyes. Yet Gideon made one final play. He opened the brass ledger and tore free a folded deed. "Silas Boone's ranch sits on access to the lower springs. Sign this claim to me and I leave your promise untouched." A bargain wrapped as peace. Silas took the paper, studied it, then fed it into the council fire without a word. Dry cedar snapped. Smoke rose. Somewhere an elder laughed low with approval. For the first time Gideon looked beaten though not surrendered. He mounted abruptly, gathering his men. "You think this ends in romance," he said coldly. "By noon federal surveyors will ride here with papers stronger than tribal vows." He wheeled his horse and rode for the ridge. But Taze watched him go with strange calm. "Let him bring papers." Then he looked toward Chief Red Hawk. "It is time they know why 200 warriors first rode to the cowboy's cabin." Silas turned, startled. He had believed he knew. A debt, a marriage promise. Yet the chief's eyes held one last hidden fire. "No, river man," he said. "They did not surround your cabin for war or courtship." He raised the feathered staff toward the awakening sun. "They came to escort a ceremony older than either." And behind the council circle, women began laying white blankets in the dust. White blankets spread across the basin floor in 2 long rows, bright against red earth like winter laid gently upon desert dust. And Silas Boone understood in that moment how little he had understood at all. What he had mistaken for siege had begun as procession. What he had feared as judgment had been invitation. 200 warriors had not ridden to surround one man, but to escort an old covenant home. Women placed bowls of spring water beside the blankets. Elders arranged cedar smoke that curled blue in the warming air. Even the horses seemed quieter, heads lowered as if sensing sacred order. Silas stood still while Chief Red Hawk came beside him, old feathers stirring in a light breeze. "When a life debt is answered by kinship," the chief said, "the people do not send one messenger. They send honor in numbers too large for doubt." His weathered hand gestured toward the warriors. "Every rider you saw at your cabin came because each family wished witness." The words struck deeper than praise. Silas had spent years believing solitude was safer than belonging. Yet here belonging had arrived on horseback. Ayanna stepped onto one white blanket and motioned him to the other. No preacher, no judge, only witnesses and earth. River Grandmother placed the silver pendant between them and spoke in Apache first, then English for Silas. "What the river separated, memory returns." The phrase moved through him like spring water through dry ground. Then Taze brought forth a folded hide older than any paper Gideon carried. A treaty, marked by tribal elders and frontier settlers long dead, recognizing the hidden springs as shared sanctuary, never for sale. Eleanor Boone's name was among the witnesses. Silas stared at his mother's careful signature and felt the last hard shell around his heart begin to give way. Yet the greatest twist was still waiting. Chief Red Hawk raised his staff and addressed the gathered people. Years ago I vowed if the riverman returned with honor, my daughter would choose freely. He turned to Ayanna. Not as debt, as sovereign heart. Ayanna looked at Silas, and for once the fierceness in her carried no guarded edge. Only peace. I choose. 2 simple words, but they settled heavier than law. As she placed the pendant cord in Silas's hands, a shout rose from the ridge. Riders again. This time federal surveyors indeed, led by a stern official in blue coat, papers in hand. Dust swirled as they entered the basin expecting dispute. Gideon Voss, who had lingered near the ridge hoping rescue by authority, straightened with fresh confidence. But the surveyor dismounted, studied the old hide treaty Taze presented, then removed his spectacles and read in long silence. Finally, he folded the government papers and faced Gideon. These springs are protected under territorial covenant. Gideon's face drained of certainty. No one jeered. No one reached for triumph. Justice arrived quieter than that. Gideon looked around as though expecting enemies and found only witnesses. Then something stranger happened. Chief Red Hawk stepped toward the man who had schemed against him and offered a small carved water cup. Drink, he said. Leave as guest, not thief. Even Gideon seemed shaken by mercy he had not earned. He took the cup with lowered eyes. Silas realized then this was the final lesson hidden beneath every twist since dawn. Power humbled not by force, but dignity. As the surveyors withdrew and Gideon rode away diminished more by grace than defeat, the 200 warriors began striking spear but softly into earth in a rhythm like distant thunder. Wedding chant. Escort chant. Not war. Never war. Ayanna leaned close enough for only Silas to hear. There is one last custom before sunset. He looked at her, almost afraid to ask. Her smile held mischief now. The cowboy must return to the cabin where 200 warriors first waited. She glanced toward the far valley trail. Because that is where the old chief means to place a final gift at your door. By late afternoon, the long procession wound back toward Silas Boone's cabin, though no one rode in the tense silence of that first dawn. Horses moved easy now. Children laughed from saddle blankets. Women sang low songs carried on warm desert wind. Even the old chief seemed lighter, as if a burden older than his gray braids had at last been laid down. When the cabin came into view against the cottonwoods, Silas stopped in the same place he had stood that morning with coffee cooling in his hand, and for a strange moment it felt as though a lifetime had passed between sunrise and now. Yet the greatest surprise waited in the yard. The 200 warriors formed again in a wide circle, not facing the cabin this time, but facing outward, as though guarding something precious at its center. There, beside the porch beneath the medicine charm, stood a mare the color of desert rain, silver-gray and calm-eyed, with braided reins worked in turquoise. Chief Red Hawk placed a hand on her neck. Final gift, he said, for the river man who believed he lived alone. Silas could not speak. In frontier country, a horse was more than property. It was trust made flesh. But the old chief had one more gift still. He pointed toward the porch door. Silas stepped inside the little cabin where cedar light slanted through cracks in the wall, and on his rough-hewn table lay the cedar trunk that had belonged to his mother, a thing he had not seen since boyhood. Taze had brought it from tribal stores where Eleanor Boone's keepsakes had been guarded all these years. With slow hands Silas opened it. Inside rested folded cloth, beadwork, and a final letter sealed in wax brittle with age. He opened it while the whole cabin seemed to hold breath. My son, if this reaches you, it means the canyon has remembered what men forgot. Do not fear if one day warriors come to your door. Some arrivals look like danger only because grace often rides wearing dust. Silas closed his eyes. Outside, Wind stirred the porch boards exactly as it had when he was a boy listening to his mother hum old songs. When he stepped back into the light, Ayanna was waiting near the mare, one hand resting on the saddle. My father says a home is not complete until two riders leave it together. There was teasing in her voice now, but something deeper too. Peace, hard one. As sunset burned copper across the valley, no formal vows were spoken. None were needed. River grandmother tied the silver pendant once more, this time around the cabin door, not either neck. So the promise belongs to the house, she said, not the people. Even that carried frontier wisdom. Love held by possession can sour. Love rooted in shelter endures. Then the warriors began to depart in twos and threes, fading into red dusk until the valley grew wide and quiet again. Before leaving, Gideon Voss, humbled more than ruined, rode back alone and stopped at the fence. He looked at Silas a long moment. I chased springs and nearly lost my soul over water. Silas said nothing. At last Gideon nodded toward Ayanna. You were richer this morning than I understood. He turned and rode west into evening. No punishment, no triumph, only a man left to reckon with himself. After dark, porch lantern glowing soft, Silas and Ayanna sat listening to crickets and distant horses. The old chief had already ridden out with his people. The world felt larger and quieter than before. Did you know, Silas asked at last, when you looked at me this morning, what all this would become? Ayanna smiled into the dark. No, she paused, hearing wind move through sage. I only knew 200 warriors came to witness whether one man would remember kindness. Silence settled, deep and gentle. Somewhere an owl called. The medicine charm tapped lightly against the door in the night breeze. And out there, where law once rode armed and lonely, justice had come another way, by a daughter's choice, an old chief's mercy, and a cowboy brave enough to stay when the world arrived at his cabin. In the territories, old men would tell it for years in simpler words. They came looking for war. They found a family.